The Lord be with you. It works like magic. The Right Reverend Eugene Taylor Sutton, Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Maryland since 2008, has also served as senior pastor of the Chautauqua Institution since earlier this calendar year. He was canon pastor of the Washington National Cathedral and director of its Center for Prayer and Pilgrimage from 2000 to 2008. In his over 40 years of ordained ministry, you can get away with less. Black don't cry. He has served as a college chaplain, parish priest, and professor of homiletics and liturgy at Vanderbilt University Divinity School. Recognized nationally as a leader on the issue of racial reparations, Bishop Sutton testified before the U.S. Congress with author Ta-Nehisi Coates and actor Danny Glover for the establishment of a national bipartisan commission to study and make recommendations for addressing reparations as a restitution for slavery, its legacy, and racial discrimination. He has appeared on National Public Radio, Fox News, PBS, the Chautauqua Institution, and several other educational and religious institutions on the necessity of taking concrete actions of justice to achieve racial reconciliation in America. To observe the 150th anniversary of the end of U.S. chattel slavery on All Saints' Day in 2014, he led a day-long Truth and Reconciliation pilgrimage that visited 5 Maryland sites with strong ties to both slavery and the Episcopal Church. Bishop Sutton, the work of the Trail of Souls continues. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely embarrassing. They never say enough. Or I couldn't keep a job. But it is my pleasure, very much of a pleasure to be here. I bring you greetings from your siblings, your friends, your sisters and brothers, and others in the Episcopal Diocese of Maryland, where nothing ever happens outside of a fierce and tenacious commitment to reconciliation. When our diocese made a commitment some years ago that said that our vision statement, how we wanted to see ourselves, is very simple: as a community of love. The love of Christ coming within our hearts, it's extended to our family and friends, and it extends to all the structures in society and of life. So I am very honored to be privileged to be asked to moderate this session of distinguished persons within our church who've done some amazing things in the work of reconciliation. First of all, just to introduce them briefly to you, Robert Black. Father Black is the rector of St. Luke's Church in Salisbury, North Carolina. Next to him is the Reverend Deacon Natalie Conway, deacon of Memorial Church in Baltimore, Maryland. Good to see you again, Deacon. There's a story to say, too, about how I was with her in the Holy Land looking over Jerusalem when the call clearly came for her to serve God and God's church as deacon. And even today, we still in our minds look over that city and weep over it, as our Lord wept over the violence in the Middle East today. Next to her is Mr. Christopher Pupke. He is the historian of St. Paul's Church in Centerville, Maryland. And then next to him is the Reverend Jermon Taylor, rector of St. Ambrose Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. Seated next to him is Ms. Ellen Weig. She is archivist at St. Paul's Church in Wilmington, North Carolina. And then next to her, finally, is the Reverend Gideon Pollock. He is rector of St. John's church in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. All of us have a story to tell about what the Spirit has been doing and moving us toward more reconciliation and justice in our communities. And so, with no further ado, and before we get to questions, they each have an opening statement about the work of God in their particular setting and their ministry. Father Black.
Again, it's a great honor to be invited back to Virginia Seminary, and I'm delighted to share with you some of the ways in which the Spirit has been moving at St. Luke's Salisbury. I've got a presentation that I assume will be showing up soon. But I'll start to just tell you a little bit about St. Luke's and Salisbury. So both the city and the parish were established at the same time by an act of the Colonial Assembly in 1753. So you can see our lovely historic parish there on the left. The building was built in 1828. That photo is probably taken in the early 1890s. And then the photo on the right from last spring. It's a lovely place in springtime. And at some point, there is the clicker, so I can advance. And so one of the things about St. Luke's to understand where we got going on this work is that we are located in downtown Salisbury, which means that we are right next door to the county jail and the county courthouse and a whole bunch of lawyers' offices. So our neighbors are the criminal justice system. And so as we got to know our neighbors better, we started to learn a lot about the racial inequities in that system. And this was about the same time that our former diocesan bishop, now presiding Bishop Michael Curry, and his office was talking about the paradigm of becoming beloved community. And so we picked that language up and have been running with that ever since. And so I just want to sort of share with you all some things that we've done under that heading of becoming beloved community. So the first, I'll warn you that that QR code there in the corner, if you scan it, it's a YouTube link, so it might start playing on your phones immediately. So mute your phones if you want to scan that. But the first thing we did, and it really ties well with the presentation we just had about history makers, is we did a oral history. We have several members of our congregation who are African Americans who grew up in Salisbury during the Jim Crow era, and we wanted to capture their stories in their own voices so that they would be preserved for future generations. And so what you're seeing there is a screening of the documentary that we produced. And so that QR code in the corner will take you to that video, or if you just go to the church's YouTube page, you can find it there. It's about an 18-minute video. It's very well done. We've interviewed several folks, including the person you can see on the screen there, presiding Bishop Curry, and all of the individual interviews are archived on our YouTube page in addition to the 18-minute documentary. So if you want to see the full interview with Bishop Curry, which is outstanding, head to our YouTube page and you'll find it there. And I've got a trailer of that video.
Beloved community is a community shaped and defined and destined by the reality of unselfish and often sacrificial love. And that's a different kind of community.
So again, go to YouTube and you can watch the full thing there. The next thing we did is we followed up by having, on the left side, you see Will Willimon, a United Methodist bishop, and Catherine Meeks. We brought them to Salisbury to talk about the state of racial relations currently. And then on the right, you see a presentation in our church. We commissioned a historian to research the history of our parish as it relates to slavery and race. And so that presentation was given Martin Luther King weekend of 2020. Some other things we've done. Elizabeth Duncan Kuntz was a member of our parish. She is an Episcopalian, someone that I hope that the church will learn more about. We remember her every year near the date of her death. And so this was a presentation we did last year. And then Rowan County, this is just up the street from us, is the site of the first EJI marker that marks lynchings that happened throughout the South, well, throughout the whole country. The first one to be placed in North Carolina is just on the same block as our church, and we were a part of that. One of the things that we've gotten a lot of notoriety for recently is an icon project. So we have a lovely and historic space, but the stained glass windows, which most of went in the late 1800s, early 1900s, as you can imagine, do not depict people in the most historically accurate way. And so we decided to add. And so we added several icons. You could see the church nave on the left, our chapel on the right. These are 4 icons that are in the nave. We have Manteo, Henry Beard Delaney, Elizabeth Duncan Kuntz, and William Wilberforce. Again, adding diversity, and in William Wilberforce, an example of someone who used privilege and power to help those without as much of a voice. And so we added those. On the back wall of our sanctuary, we have these 2 large icons. These are 5 feet by 7 feet in real person, so probably close to what the size you see there. The one on the left is Transfiguration. The one on the right is Pentecost. The commission in particular for Pentecost that we gave to the iconographer Kelly Lattimore was that whoever walks in this church should be able to find someone in that icon that they can connect with. And I think that he did a fantastic job with that commission. And then in our chapel, we added a couple of panels that, again, striving to show deeper diversity and representation in there. And then other things we've been doing, we partner with the local, right up the street, Soldiers Memorial AME Zion Church. We've had conversations with them around race. We've had forums by the police department. We host, or are part of an organization that hosts racial equity workshops in our community. And so we try to, again, not only tell that story and seek reconciliation in our worship space, but also in how we are involved and active in the community.
Thank you very much. Yes, keep this on for a while. I should have mentioned before just a bit more about Dr. Black. He's been there since 2014, and he previously served parishes in Greensboro and Washington, D.C., and he holds his degrees in religious studies from Wake Forest University, the University of the South, but before that, the Virginia Theological Seminary. So thank you very much. Give him your love for that. Next, we have the Reverend Natalie Conway. She just recently retired as deacon at Memorial Episcopal Church in Baltimore. Reverend Conway is a cradle Episcopalian, attending church in Baltimore for most of her life. After college, she worked at the U.S. Department of State and retired in 1997 and began working in the diocesan offices in the year 2000 as transitional officer. She began ordained formation in 2008 and pursued the diaconate, ordained deacon in 2013. Her interests include social justice and racial reconciliation, having served as co-chair for our Diocesan Truth and Reconciliation Commission and as president of the Diocesan Standing Committee. Natalie?
That would be me.
That is you.
Is it working?
Yes.
Okay. I do have a little presentation that tells the story or tells my story, and I will tell a little bit more of that story after you look at the news clip from WJZ in Baltimore.
I think about the resilience of these my folks, how they survived with the work and the labor.
Reverend Natalie Conway is the deacon at the Memorial Episcopal Church in Bolton Hill. But on this day, she recounted finding out that her great-great-grandmother, Harriet Cromwell, was enslaved here at the Hampton National Historic Site, formerly Hampton Plantation in Towson, off of Delaney Valley Road.
They called her Hattie. And when she was manumitted in 1828, she had a one-year-old son with her who was able to go with her. Anyone 2 and up had to stay here.
Anyone up to age 35, in other words, those who could work. Conway learned of her family connection to the plantation 2 years ago while she and her brother were looking into their genealogy. They found out members of their family, the Cromwells, were among the 450 slaves that worked this plantation. That led to an aha moment.
And I had been sitting in the back of the church on one of the pews that if I looked up, I could see the plaques. And the plaques were dedicated to Charles Ridgely Howard. And I was like, oh my goodness.
Charles Ridgely Howard was the founding rector of Memorial. His mother, Sophia Go Ridgely, was born here, as was Charles. Sophia married James Howard, and they lived here at Hampton Plantation.
Sophia gave a gift of $5,000 to build the church. The Reverend Gray Maggiano is the rector of Memorial. He asked Conway to tell her story to the congregation.
I encouraged her to help to tell this story because it was going to be the thing that was really going to drive a lot of change, not only with our church, but in the diocese and maybe in the city.
Conway opened up to the church. She and members of the congregation held a healing ceremony at the Hampton site. And later, the church leadership and members talked about what used to hang here in the back of the church. In June of 2020, the decision was made to remove those plaques honoring Charles Ridgely Howard. Conway says it was unanimous. They had to go.
You have to keep the history, but I don't think the history of what was done here should be in a place of peace.
The plaques have been placed outside of the church, but the scars of the past remain. Memorial is now taking a close look at its own history. It has started a 5-year reparations initiative committing $100,000 a year.
That is going to focus particularly on organizations and individuals that are doing work in 4 areas in West Baltimore in our zip code where we have been responsible for harm.
Conway is active in making that happen. Still, she is in awe that she drove past this plantation for years, and it was her faith that finally brought her face to face with her past.
I want to picture folks, and what they were doing and how they were doing it.
In Towson, Lisa Robinson, WBAL TV 11 News.
So, when I first saw those plaques, when I first went out to the mansion before, just to see what was out there, we got information from a cousin who said that the family might be out there. And my brother and I went, and there was a room that listed, had a bulletin board that listed all the families. And sure enough, my family's name was listed on that billboard. When we went out to the mansion with the Church of St. Catherine of Alexandria, a predominantly African-American church, and we all stood in a circle. It was about 50 of us, and we did that libation ceremony. But members of the parish had taken those names and put them on a billboard outside of the church, and it snowballed from there. The first person to contact me was from Fox News. They had driven by the church and seen the names and wanted to know what was going on. And then WBAL, WJZ, the Baltimore Sun. I mean, I think I've told this story 10 zillion times, but I have to keep telling the story. So when I sat in the back of the church and looked up at those plaques and said, I can't stay here. I'm going to call Bishop Eugene and have him move me. I can't stay here. So Gray Maggiano, the rector, said, please pray on this. You need to tell this. I said, okay. So I have a plaque in my bedroom that says, "Be still and know that I am God." And God said, "Why do you think I put you there?" So I went back and I told the story, and people were shocked, amazed, and what can we do? How can we help to heal this place? Because this church should not, even though it's history, yes, and we're beginning to uncover a lot of it, and still need to uncover more of it, then we won't heal. We won't be as one diverse community. And we won't be that beloved community of love. So I keep telling that story. I really did want to take a sledgehammer to those plaques. I really did. But no, they're part of the history, and they're placed outside the church, and they're placed in a position where they won't be damaged. And we're still working toward the reconciliation.
Yes, yes. And that church, Memorial Church, thank you so much, Natalie, for that. That church in the city of Baltimore, which was a symbol of white resistance and segregation for much of its history, is now one of those at the forefront of racial justice and reconciliation in the Diocese of Maryland. My, how the Spirit can work. And now we have the Reverend Gideon Pollock. He is rector of St. John's Episcopal Church in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, in the Diocese of Long Island. St. John's has an ongoing project to care for and remediate the neglect of a historic burying ground for people of color, which may be the final resting place for up to 200 people in informally marked graves. Before coming to Long Island, Gideon was the head chaplain of the Episcopal High School, where he also served as a trustee of Fort Ward Park and its historic burying areas. Father Pollock.
Thank you, Bishop. Can I have the clicker? Thank you, Jermaine. I should start by saying I'm humbled to be here. The work that we're doing, I think, is important work, but I think it pales in comparison to some of my colleagues on the panel. I want to tell a brief story about my first days at St. John's in Cold Spring Harbor. St. John's in Cold Spring Harbor is on the North Shore of Long Island. We sit on a large campus that we own, which includes a 14-acre freshwater pond and 6 acres of the inner harbor of Cold Spring Harbor, looking out towards Stamford, Connecticut. And when I first arrived, I had that feeling that maybe other clergy who've served as rectors of congregations have had that feeling of, what am I doing here? And certainly not equal to the task ahead of me. And as part of my orientation, I had a little tour of the grounds, which took most of a day. And as we were driving down one of the roads that's parallel to the church, the person giving me the tour, who was a buildings and grounds person, sort of waved vaguely and said, "And over there is our slave cemetery." And I had just come from across the fence here, where I had been a trustee at Fort Ward Park. And I was a trustee there because they have a burying ground that was desecrated in 1965, or 1961 really, in preparation for the 100th anniversary of the Civil War, where they moved all of the headstones in order to expand the park. And the living descendants of that community that had lived there and had buried their dead there, and had many of them escaped slavery by getting to Fort Ward, had this ongoing trauma of the fact that their graves had been desecrated. And I served as a trustee to try and mediate the relationship between the descendant community and the city of Alexandria. And I have to admit that it was a difficult piece of work, and when I was called to Long Island, I was thankful to put that burden down. Until I got to Long Island and found that we owned a neglected burying ground. And our knowledge of our burying ground comes from largely from the woman who you see in this photo, Denise Evans. Denise showed up at my office one day looking for the burying place of her family. And we also own a 25-acre cemetery up the road from us that's historic. And so we suggested maybe check at the cemetery because that's where the people are buried. And she said, no, I've been to the cemetery. They're not there. And I said, well, we have another Jones family plot that's up the hill. And she said, well, they weren't Joneses. And I said, okay. I said, well, the last thing I can think of is we have a slave cemetery. And she looked at me and she said, well, they wouldn't be there either. And I said, oh no? And she said, they were never enslaved. And that's when I realized that our institutional knowledge of who might be buried in our cemetery was sorely lacking and probably incorrect. And it turns out it's very incorrect. Our cemetery, this is Denise and I at the cemetery. There's a derelict home on the left. Denise and I came to the cemetery to look for ourselves. And when we came in, we found a tremendous amount of discarded refuse. It had become a dumping spot for landscapers. And there's also, to my right, there's a jet ski. And we are near the water, but not near enough that a jet ski is needed here. It had been left there. So we started cleaning it up. And this is the trash after about an hour of cleanup. And we uncovered these headstones. And we continued to look, and I've got pictures. This is almost imperceptible, but you can see in the middle of the photo a headstone, very small and ancient. And we found these, of course. These are the last two burials in the cemetery. These ones have names. This is from the year 1900. Alfred Thorne and his mother, Patience, are both buried there. We knew then that the cemetery was active until 1900, but we still don't know how active. Now, this is a head and footstone of a child. And this is a burying mound, very different than the other burying areas, clearly pointing to a different burial practice, which made us think that perhaps there was a more diverse collection of people buried here than we might know. And we have since learned, of course, that although there are almost no indigenous people in Cold Spring Harbor now, in fact, Cold Spring Harbor, the population, only 2.5% of our population in our little census-designated place are people of color. It's 97.5% white. And this burying area is obviously different than the others. But we just started to catalog another child, another headstone, another set of head and feet. And when we finally we cleared all the leaves with blowers, and we tried to understand the scope of the cemetery, we realized that it was an ordered set of rows and courses, and that if you counted the rows and the courses, there were 200 burial areas. So we turned then to our records together with Denise, and we found in our baptism records these records. And you can see the Christian name and surname. The abbreviation is COL for colored. And then in marriages, we found these. And in marriages, we found more. And what we found over time, as we've continued to look, is that our congregation in the 19th century was significantly more diverse than it is in the 20th century. And that the segregation, the history of segregation and isolation that's taken place since the 19th century has diminished our understanding of who we are significantly. We have since recovered the names of nearly 35 people who are buried in our burying ground, and with the help of Denise and their families. And every year, we do a remediation. We clean up the leaves carefully, and we celebrate on All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. We pray together on the site, and we remember those who are buried there in unmarked informal graves in our services at St. John's every All Saints' Day, and we invite the families to join us. Many of the families are still on Long Island, not in, that you're only in Long Island if you've dug a hole. You're on Long Island, otherwise I learned that shortly after arriving. But we have found that these folks who we name every year were a collection of families very closely related socially and by family ties. And we think that we can probably continue to fill out our register of those who were buried at St. John's in our burying ground. And we hope to continue to do that with the families and continue to honor and mark their legacy at St. John's. It's amazing when you look at the headstones, there are no markings at all, except for some informal hatchet marks or otherwise carvings. And it's really moving to be there. And it's been amazing for us to be connected to folks who were a deep part of our community in a time that has since been erased from memory. And so thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you for that witness. And now Mr. Christopher Pupke. He is the executive director of the Biophilia Foundation, a private foundation dedicated to advancing biodiversity conservation on private lands. As a lay historian, Mr. Pupke is past president of Maryland's Queen Anne's County Historical Society. He has conducted important research on local U.S. colored troops that served in the Union Army during the Civil War. He's a member of the advisory board of the Kennard African American Cultural Heritage Center, where he has helped develop museum exhibits and lectured on local Black history. Mr. Pupke is an active member at Historic St. Paul's Parish in Centerville, Maryland. He recently wrote a history of the parish and has lectured on Black history at St. Paul's. He's donated many of his papers and other fruits of his research to the AAEHC, and it includes, of course, the history of St. Paul's. Mr. Pupke.
I'm going to borrow the lectern because some of my slides I've got to read to you all, and I'll try and be very quick. This is St. Paul's, Centerville, Maryland, on the eastern shore. If you've ever crossed the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, you've landed in Queen Anne's County, not too far from St. Paul's. Founded in 1692 by the Vestry Act, our current church was built and dedicated in 1835. I'm going to talk about our relationship with race, but I'm also going to mention where we find this information. You can find some of it in local papers. Here I knew that one of our rectors was named Robert Goldsborough, and so when I read the June 23rd, 1832 edition of the Centerville Times, I find the Reverend Mr. Goldsborough mentioned in a meeting of the Queen Anne's County chapter of the Maryland Colonization Society. This was a chapter of the National Society that helped establish the country of Liberia, where we looked at the problem of having free African Americans in Queen Anne's County in Maryland, and said, I've got an idea. We'll send them back to Africa, hence the country of Liberia and the county of Maryland in Liberia that exists today. And this was an effort in Queen Anne's County, driven in part by our rector at St. Paul's. And if you dig further, you can see the name of one Harriet Harper, who was enslaved by an individual in our parish who made that journey, leaving from Baltimore December 24th, 1832, and landing in Cape Palmas, Liberia in February of 1833. Also, reports to diocesan conventions and the St. Paul's Register. In the report to the convention in 1844, we have a list of baptisms, marriages, and funerals, 52, 38, and 2. The baptisms, white adults 1, infants 11, colored 40. Marriages, white 2, colored 36. Funerals, white 1, colored 1. Over a 4-year period from 1841 to 45, we baptized at St. Paul's 110 African Americans, and 106 African Americans were married. St. Paul's was a diverse community. This has not been part of our history. We talk about how we became a segregated church. It's because we took these individuals and told them, you're not welcome here. If you look at the St. Paul's Register in 1844, you can see some of the names of the individuals who were baptized here. At the top, we have baptized on Wednesday evening Thomas Henry, son of Dr. Robert and Ellen Robert Goldsboro. The other lists don't have names. It's just 4 colored children at Judge Earl's, or 2 colored children at the parsonage. We did not honor them by recording their name in the parish register. Their names are lost to history. We're also fortunate at St. Paul's to have an individual who wrote a slave narrative. This is J.D. Green, who escaped from Kentucky, but he tells his account of his 3 escapes, his first in 1839 being from Centerville. And when he was about 10 years old, his mother came up to him and said, "We need to pray," and that was the last time he saw her. She was praying with him because she was being sold away. He would never see his mother again. Years later, he was sent on an errand into town about 4 miles distant from where he was enslaved, and when he came back, he found out that his wife and children had been sold away. He would never see them again, and that is when he resolved himself to make an escape. He escaped, lived in New Jersey for several years, was recaptured in New Jersey, sold south, but eventually made his way out and became free and wrote a slave narrative. And the individual that enslaved him is known we know as Judge Richard Tillman Earl. In that parish register, we just heard 3 or 4 individuals who were baptized at Judge Earl's, maybe relatives of Jacob Green. We can also read their own words here. This is a couple of difficult slides coming up, but this is the Reverend E.J. Stearns, who was rector at St. Paul's during the Civil War. He wrote an answer to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I'll just read some of that. And I should say he's very Southern in his sympathies. When the Bishop of Maryland, forgive me for announcing this, said that thou shalt say a prayer of thanksgiving for Union victories, the Reverend Mr. Stearns said, "I will not," at St. Paul's, lead that prayer. But I'll just read this real quick, talking about the slave trade, not even enslavement, but the slave trade itself. The slave thus brought under the control of a Christian master would be as much better off than he was under his savage master in Africa, as the German or Irish peasant in this country is better off than he was in his native land. Nay, taking into consideration the slave's own improvement under enslavement, and that of his posterity, their gradual civilization and Christianization, he would be the far greater gainer of the two. So he's using their Christianization as an excuse for slavery. You can also turn to some of the memorials in the church. We have in our sanctuary the altars dedicated to Bishop Henry C. Lay, Virginia Theological Seminary class of 1846. He was the first bishop of Easton. Before that, he was Bishop of Arkansas, and he helped reunite the Episcopal Church at the end of the Civil War. He was a Southern sympathizer during the war. He was known as the chaplain to the Army of the Tennessee, the Confederate Army, and he was there present with Confederate General John Bell Hood during the siege of Atlanta. And so we can look at his words and see what his words say. Here's a part of a sermon that he gave in Emmanuel Church, Powhatan, Virginia, a little bit west of Richmond, on March 3rd, 1864. And I have over here the actual text in his own handwriting from the University of North Carolina, Wilson's library there, but I'll read it from the easier to read version. What ruin of body and soul awaits them, the Negro, in Bishop Lay's word, when they exchange kind masters. Remember Richard Tillman Earl, the kind master who sold off Jacob Green's family? That's the kind of master that they have. When they exchange kind masters for pretended friends, leaving all other considerations apart, this one consideration alone seems decisive of our duty. This war, the Civil War, is in a true and holy sense a war for the Negro. and we would be false and craven if we did not stand forth in defense of our dependents and preserve them from demoralization and extermination. So VTS alumni, bishop in the Episcopal Church, is saying that the Civil War is a war for the enslaved individuals. Difficult to understand that until we look at his reasoning. They are an inferior race committed to our guardianship by divine providence for our mutual benefit, the very definition of racism. Finally, deeds of manumission. This one is for a man named James Taylor, who was enslaved by a member of St. Paul's. He would go on to serve in the United States Colored Troops. After the war, he came back and worked as sexton at St. Paul's for decades. He was married by the rector at St. Paul's in 1867. I've identified 64 individuals who were enslaved at St. Paul's by St. Paul's congregation members that served in the United States Colored Troops. That's almost 1% of the individuals from the state of Maryland that served in the United States Colored Troops came from St. Paul's Parish. And there's the list of their names. And we have dedicated a plaque in memory of Mr. James Taylor in the back of our church, just in the last year and a half, Juneteenth 2022, as a way to remember the contributions that these individuals gave to our congregation. Thank you.
Thank you. These are powerful stories, powerful stories. The Reverend Jermon Taylor has served as the rector of St. Ambrose Church in Raleigh since 2012. Father Taylor nurtures a season of liturgical renewal with an emphasis on Black American and African culture through Ethiopian Orthodox icons as Stations of the Cross, icons, and kneelers of Black Episcopal saints, as included, and also in addition, Episcopal service music based on the spirituals, and a jazz mass. St. Ambrose gave birth to the environmental justice movement in Southeast Raleigh in the 1990s as a response to community flooding. In 2022, Father Taylor received Sewanee's School of Theology Award for service and the Lilly Endowment Clergy Renewal Sabbatical Grant. He chairs Raleigh's Stormwater Commission, and he is married to Kirsten, and they have 2 young children. Father?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Bishop. St. Ambrose was founded in 1868 in conjunction with St. Augustine's University, the historically Black Episcopal College in Raleigh, North Carolina, by the same individual. Father Smith founded St. Augustine's to educate those recently emancipated African Americans, St. Ambrose for their Christian formation. And we started in Smoky Hollow. You can see a picture of the church here from a painting in 1872. Smoky Hollow was where freed Black people lived during the institution of slavery. It got its name from its proximity to the Raleigh-Gaston Railroad because the noxious gases and smoke from the train would go into this low-lying areas. We can imagine that the respiratory diseases during that time, though we don't have data, was high. A couple of things happened between 1896 and 1900. In 1898, let me start by saying that January 6th, that date is seared in our mind, not because so much of the Epiphany, but what happened not too far from here in the storm of the Capitol building. Well, in 1898, a very conservative Democratic Party was elected to General Assembly. That same year, we get the Wilmington riots, where a white supremacist mob storms the government buildings in Wilmington, ousts the duly elected mayor, ousts the city council, and institute their own white supremacist mayor and city council. That same year, the General Assembly begins segregation. And Raleigh is unique in that 2 color lines were found. Most cities have at least 1 color line, but Raleigh had 2 color lines. So the color line, the Conservative Democratic Party elected to the General Assembly, and the Melrose Mill Company eyed our church's property. So all of these things contributed to the perfect storm that caused us to physically pick up our church, put it on logs and rollers, and we rolled it a mile south across 2 color lines to Shaw University, the historically black university in Raleigh, North Carolina, the oldest in the South. So we went from a place where the cotton mill wanted to be to an old tobacco warehouse. Talk about the irony of people who were enslaved picking those 2 products. And so this is what we read in the 1901 report to the Diocesan Convention, then by the Archdeacon for Colored Work. And really what I want to draw your attention to is that he says, perhaps the greatest thing St. Ambrose has done in his short 32-year history is to physically move the black church closer to black people. And that's something that's been a part of our DNA and that we've done twice in our history. So we moved our Carpenter Gothic style church to Wilmington and Cabarrus Street. This is a photo from 1963. And it remained there until 1965 when we had a number of things happen. Let me just play this short video clip. This is a clip from 1943. We remember the royal wedding. This was considered a royal wedding in Raleigh in 1943, the marriage of 2 black social elites. This is the granddaughter of Henry Beard Delaney, married in 1943 at St. Ambrose Church. The priest there was Father Thompson, and the acolytes processing from the church after that wedding. So we moved to Rochester Heights. In 1956, the city of Raleigh zoned 2 neighborhoods for black people to live during segregation. One of them is Rochester Heights. You see drone footage of Rochester Heights. You'll see St. Ambrose on your right. The issue with moving to Rochester Heights or having this neighborhood formed is that city of Raleigh decided that where the city had dumped raw sewage for 70 years and was a de facto dumping site was then where the black church would be. My friend, Father Harold Lewis of blessed memory, when he came to St. Ambrose and heard this story, he said, well, Father, it sounds like they dumped sewage, they dumped garbage, and they dumped Negroes. And that's exactly what happened. And so out of that, we began the environmental justice movement in Southeast Raleigh, responding to environmental racism. This is a Google Maps floodplain map of Rochester Heights, these 57 acres zoned for black people to live during segregation. When black people purchased their homes, they were promised that their homes would not flood, and indeed their homes did indeed flood. And so the floodplain map, the blue is where Walnut Creek, so that's always wet. But you have the 100-year floodplain or the 1% flooding event, and you can see how houses that stand today still flood. These smaller, lighter colored, maybe it's yellow or green, rectangles at the top, those used to be homes that were washed off their foundation, and the city purchased the properties. Flooding is still an issue that we deal with today. This is an example of what happens after a rain event in Rochester Heights. So we responded with starting an environmental movement called Partners for Environmental Justice in 1995 to deal with the flooding in Southeast Raleigh, and that organization still exists today. Our newest endeavor began in 2021. When I came to St. Ambrose in 2012, I walked with an environmentalist who's a member of the church, Dr. Norman Camp of blessed memory, one of the first black graduates of NC State in chemistry, and he told me about growing up in Southeast Raleigh, smelling the raw sewage that the city dumped, and dreaming of a better day. And so as he was talking, I began to have a vision of really 4 dispensations of 4 demarcations of time. The first was when the environment was pristine. This is when the Siouan, the Catawba, the Tuscarora indigenous people were in communion with the natural environment. The second phase was the engagement of Europeans and the dumping of sewage and the ravaging of the wetland. The third phase was when the city of Raleigh forced black people to live in this community, and it was the black residents who helped bring about the restoration of the environment. And then I envisioned a 4th dispensation, or 4th phase, where the environment that was now healed would bring about the healing of the black community. And so we're endeavoring on that with the Healing Pod. And the Healing Pod is in 3 phases. We received the Episcopal Church's largest environmental grant back in 2021. We begin with the podcast that talks about environmental racism in Southeast Raleigh and St. Ambrose's response. We then have an Ethiopian-inspired labyrinth. And then we started this year the Healing Garden, where we're using horticultural therapy to deal with the mental health of not only the St. Ambrose community, but the larger Southeast Raleigh black community. The science behind that is, as people engage in the environment through the planting, the weeding, the taking care of plants, it helps them deal with their trauma and overall mental health. It's a little bit about liturgically at St. Ambrose. I say St. Ambrose is a congregation where we are committed to disrupting white supremacy in the liturgy. I argue that as Episcopalians, the thing that we do most often that thwarts the reconciliation work is our liturgy. And our liturgy can be fraught with white supremacy if we are not intentional about what we sing, preach, read, and even the images in the church. And so this is a procession, Palm Sunday procession, integrating aspects from the Ethiopian tradition, which I call indigenous African Christianity, Christianity on the continent, before the engagement of European slave traders and colonialists. And then a couple of icons that we have. In 2016, I commissioned an Ethiopian iconographer out of New Hampshire to redo our Station of the Cross in the Ethiopian iconographic tradition, because our current stations were of an Italian Jesus. And there was a disconnect between a white Jesus on the wall and the black people sitting in the pews. And so it took them 2 years to redo, or actually to do, stations in the Ethiopic tradition. One of them you see on your right is the 12th Station of the Cross. Jesus dies on the cross. And then we also have 3 icons to saints in the Episcopal Church, black saints in the Episcopal Church. This is a Blessed Pauline Murray, who preached at St. Ambrose in 1978, newly after being ordained. We also have an icon of Blessed Anna Julia Cooper, the first black woman to receive a PhD from the Sorbonne in Paris, also the only black person in the U.S. passport. She's on the last page. And an icon to Blessed Henry Beard Delaney, who was a member of St. Ambrose before his ordination and eventually becoming part of the communion of saints in the church.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. Pauline Murray, of course, whom we are still trying to commemorate in a more permanent way in Baltimore, was ordained in the Diocese of Maryland and served her churches there. And then we have Ellen Wyke. Mrs. Ellen Wyke is the parish archivist at St. Paul's Church in Wilmington, North Carolina. As parish historian, Mrs. Wyke has been able to probe more deeply into the history, stories, and spiritual DNA of the church, and has emphasized the need for the 165-year-old Episcopal Church to learn and understand its history, especially in relation to the history of Wilmington and the South. Prior to becoming the parish archivist, Mrs. Wyke was a member of the History and Archives Committee at St. Matthew's Church in Hillsborough, North Carolina. As a committee member, Mrs. Wyke focused on the church's 19th century Ladies' Sewing Society and was eventually introduced to the Episcopal Women's History Project. Ms. Wyke?
Thank you. One of the things that I've learned is that we have to learn our history before we can start to talk about our truths. There we go. Old published histories about Wilmington often include church histories, but rarely did they include St. Paul's. Why? Why were we overlooked? As North Carolina's relatively new bishop, Thomas Atkinson charged his clergy and laity with a new vision for the church. His message was to abolish the system of pew rents, to reach the working class poor and enslaved persons, to provide services for all people regardless of race or economic class or education, to provide education for the destitute, to teach the scriptures and other things, and to expand the ministry beyond the educated white clergyman. Church was not supposed to be just for the wealthy, educated people. Howard Thurman wrote in Jesus and the Disinherited that we should examine the religion of Jesus against the background of his own age and people, and to think about it with reference to the disinherited and the underprivileged. His words made me reconsider how we should approach learning our history. The first people of St. Paul's were some of Wilmington's disinherited and underprivileged, people with their backs against the wall of slavery and poverty and hunger. Moving into Wilmington in 1856, Atkinson immediately held services for a failing urban Methodist Protestant church. The membership was primarily black. His convention address in 1857 made note that he was providing services there, including marriage and a baptism of 10 children. This is the earliest recording we have of the congregation as they were becoming St. Paul's. By 1858, Atkinson honored their request and united them with white working class Episcopal families, free black craftsmen, builders, and merchants in Wilmington, and the enslaved servants of the wealthy and educated Episcopalians who attended a different church. Mr. Johns remained in charge of the black Sunday school and choir. He's also mentioned as the person Atkinson asked to draw up plans for building alterations. The list of parish black and white communicants began in February 1859. Mrs. Atkinson, the bishop's wife, was listed. She was a member of St. Paul's. She also played her own melodeon for the black choir. The bishop's servant, Richard, was the sexton, and according to vestry records, in 1860, the federal census lists 3 adult servants and 5 of their children. It's not clear to me whether they were owned by the bishop or Mrs. Atkinson, or whether they were provided with the Episcopal parsonage by the local Episcopalians. St. Paul's is fortunate to have a body of significant records and papers. A previously written history, the usual format of time periods, clergy, architectural transformations and transitions, music and milestones of the vestry, and parish records. It was important not to stop there, but to embark instead on a new pilgrimage of research. Our second parish register documents the beginning of St. Paul's as a black church and school after the Civil War. We have to acknowledge the congregation's strength and growth and achievements in the 5 years they spent becoming St. Mark's congregation at St. Paul's. Equally important, we are part of the history of the people of Wilmington, North Carolina, and the South, and years of violent and deeply disturbing events: slavery, the Civil War, the Wilmington coup of 1898, the years of Jim Crow, and the city's racial violence during the 1960s and 1970s. These are histories that are only recently being seen as truths and are somewhat still difficult for Wilmington to tell. This slide is from a 6-week adult formation series that probed deeply into our 165-year history. It was a time of epiphany moments and unrealized truth for many people who were sitting there listening. For example, it was always understood that many white families of means fled the city because of the Civil War and disease, and St. Paul's was closed. There was more to the story. Yellow fever became epidemic, suspected to have originated with a sailor. Because of the importance of the port, a Confederate military surgeon was sent to Wilmington. His published report after the war cited heavy rains, stagnant water, and unsanitary conditions as the cause. A filthy city had been pounded by heavy rains. I asked people listening to the series that morning to take a moment and imagine the conditions that free and enslaved men were forced to work in on the docks and trying to transport materials from the port city for miles through deeply rutted and muddy roads to Confederate military fortifications at Fort Fisher, and through the swampy areas of the Cape Fear River and onto railroads to go inland. Some of those men and the women who stayed in the homes as the servants were our parishioners. Oral traditions have a tendency to take on a life of their own, confirmed by repetition, or I've also heard the expression confirmed by gossip. They may not, and most likely are not, truths or complete truths. One of those was that the black members of St. Paul's were forced out of the church. In 1866, Atkinson opened St. Paul's as a Freedmen's Commission school and a black church. Attendance filled the building. 2 white female teachers came from the north. Their reports describe the poverty, the lack of clothing, the hunger, the desperation, and a deep desire to learn. Sorry. We've also learned that 4 of those young women at the school were reported ready in May 1868 to attend Dr. Smith's school in Raleigh. St. Augustine's Normal and Collegiate Institute was the school that was begun in Raleigh, and I believe they were close to being the very early, if not among the first students there. The laying of the cornerstone of St. Mark's Church occurred in 1871. The congregation freely left St. Paul's. They had purchased the property and they had built the church. They moved into their own church building in December. They have worshiped in the same church ever since, many as descendants of the original St. Paul's families. A month later, St. Paul's was reorganized by a few zealous ladies as a white-only church. At the turn of the century, shortly after the Wilmington coup of 1898, plans began for a new church. The parish of St. Paul's moved to the white suburbs, white-only restricted suburbs, in 1914. We have been an evolving and changing parish family. We've been in 2 locations and had 3 church buildings. Initially, as early Methodist Protestants and Episcopalians, poor and working white and black families, freed and enslaved people, a black church and school, ancestors to descendants, and now a denominationally and geographically diverse, mostly white congregation. Imagine the people baptized here. This is the font in our church. I can't say for sure that this baptismal font was in the building in 1858, but I like to imagine that it was. It looks very old, it seems very old, and I just think of the people who were baptized there. It is, however, evidence of a deep and lasting faith expressed by generations of congregations, and a reminder of the promises that we make in our baptismal covenant. It's hard work to search out hard truths. We're committed to seeing the reality of racism in our parish stories, telling these stories, and working toward racial healing. Thank you.
Again, very powerful stories, and thank you all for your witness and your work for the cause of the ministry of reconciliation that we've all been called to. Our session is to end today at 4:15. We may have time for a question or two. Is any? Yes, Diane. You may have to shout. Oh. Keep talking, they'll find you.
Okay. I just had a question of Ellen. There are a couple of references to Friedman's Commission. What is Friedman's Commission if it is not the Friedman's Bureau? There was a slide that talked about in the General Convention of 1865 of the Friedman's Commission. What is that?
As I understand it, as I understand it, it is not the same as what the government did. It was done by the Episcopal Church specifically to address education and other needs. It's a big question, and it's hard for me to give a brief answer, but it was something that Bishop Atkinson was involved in. It was done at the convention, I believe. There was an act at convention, General Convention, when the church unified. And as a result of that, teachers were available. North Carolina had the church in Wilmington, one in New Bern, and St. Augustine's, as a normal school and collegiate institute was organized under that umbrella. And there are reports back to them that detail stories.
Yes, and of course the Freedmen's Bureau is starting many institutions for freed blacks. I was born at Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C. Were you too? One more question. Yes, sir, over there.
Father Taylor, the healing pad, I guess it was an initiative that was done in your community addressing some of the racism that was perpetrated before you and I presume still today. The way you talked about it, I wonder if this was an initiative that was generated by St. Ambrose, or was it an interdenominational citywide initiative that had a different kind of, you had the whole city of Raleigh involved in that? I'm curious about that.
I appreciate your question. So in the late 1990s, we started a nonprofit called Partners for Environmental Justice, specifically around addressing environmental racism in Southeast Raleigh, concentrating on flooding. And so, and then that was a community organizing effort made up of churches, the city of Raleigh, nonprofits, and even corporate institutions, and that nonprofit still exists. And so that was a broader effort to clean up the wetland, to make sure that the wetland would be protected, to move it from a 5-acre center to a 56-acre protected area. So that's one thing, that's 1990s. In 2021, we started the Healing Pod, which was initiated by St. Ambrose. We're in the early phases of this. We are in conversation with the city of Raleigh, and the city of Raleigh is looking at St. Ambrose as maybe being a pilot, and they're observing how this goes to see, can this be instituted in the Parks and Recs department for the city of Raleigh. So this is, we just started in April this year. So we have a long way to go, but that was something that was started this year. So I guess to answer your question was the flooding in 1990, and then this initiative in 2021.
Have you got the clergy, all the rest of the clergy involved in Raleigh, involved with your project?
Not this one. We have a separate community organizing group that has more clergy, but this is St. Ambrose started. We're initiating it in very early stages. We want it to grow, but.
And so, my friends, I think our panelists will be available for some minutes following the program if you have any specific questions to them. Before I turn this over to to our Associate Dean for Multicultural Ministries. Just a concluding word. My friends, we've heard some powerful stories today, and it's because of these stories that the truth is uncovered about our histories. The importance of truth to reconciliation cannot be understated. There are some who want a cheap peace, and they want reconciliation with no cost, without doing the work. The work begins with the uncovering of the truth, and there are forces at work in our society that war against people knowing the truth about what happened. And so we in the Episcopal Church are standing against that. And the work that I know that our diocese has done toward repairing the work of centuries of slavery and segregation, Jim Crow, and continuing racism. The work that we've done began with uncovering the truth, and we encourage you to do that as well in all of our parishes. I now turn this over to Mr. Riley.
I just want to put this a little bit in context as the collections growth specialist. Each of the panelists here are here, each one is here because they have done significant work in uncovering uncomfortable truths. The makeup of the panel is quite intentional. Gideon Pollock, we have just discovered his story. But for everyone else, Robert Black, St. Luke's, North Carolina, Reverend Natalie Conway, Memorial Church, Baltimore, Christopher Pupke, St. Paul, Centerville, Reverend Jamon Taylor, St. Ambrose, Raleigh, North Carolina, Ellen Weig, St. Paul's, Wilmington. The stories are different, the circumstances different. The meaning is quite the same, isn't it? What do we mean when we say that we respect the dignity of every human being? The people on this panel have contributed in concrete ways by donating histories and papers and other matters and other artifacts to the African American Episcopal Historical Collection. They are donors. The reason I want to say this right now is that I want to encourage all of you, each of you, in your own parishes, to look, go, open a box, look at the papers, talk about them, and find ways to tell your stories. And when you tell them, don't forget to put them in a place like this place that will make it accessible for researchers, for questioners, in perpetuity and unfettered. Thank you. Please take a quick break and come back at 4:30. It's 4:20 now. Please return for just a few minutes. Please come back for just a few minutes. We want to wrap up the day. I have some questions to ask, and I don't know whether this is the appropriate time to do it. Joseph will take care of the end of this, but first I wanted to thank you for being with us today, and this is an essential part of our journey, our 20-year journey. And to continue on, as Juliana Richardson so eloquently exhorted us to do, we need your continued help and support. By all means, please don't hesitate to let us know your thoughts about where we need to go, with whom we need to speak, whose histories we need to record or otherwise document, and please do stop by. The success of this archive, any and every archive, is to be open to those who are curious enough to look into, to examine, to read, to ask, to write. Do so, please. One of the things I noticed, and then I'll be through, one of the things I noticed, you know, and I've said this before, working in the archive, is that there's a critical mass of geography. And it's East Coast, and it's Southern, Maryland, the Carolinas, Virginia, Bob. And I said, why? Where's everybody else? What is it? Where are we not looking? Are we hiding in plain sight? Or do we have these stories because someone is asking? Is that all we need to do? Is ask the questions? So I'm asking you, I'm begging you, start asking the questions. And let's see what happens. It's like going into the archives and saying, just show me a box, open any box. I know our head librarian gets very upset when I talk like that. But, you know, that's the way an artist does it. That's the way I like to do it. You know, go in and say, oh, just open up a box and see what's there. And inevitably, something, a surprise, comes out. And that's what we need to do, is ask the question. Thank you. Thank you for everything. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. So I actually want to begin by simply acknowledging all the people whose hard work has made today possible. And I won't, you know, go through a list of names, but I do want to name, in addition to Dr. Mitzi Buddy, Dr. Al Moss, the chairs of the steering committee, and everybody on the steering committee, I want to mention the co-chair of the anniversary committee, Linda Dieno, our Vice President for Institutional Advancement. And I also want to make sure I acknowledge Roddy Temple, who's done such incredible work for the collection and for this event. So thank you to everyone. If we could just give a round of applause. And of course to the members of the committee, all of the members of the committee who helped to organize this event. So I don't know about you, but I am going to leave from here today feeling super energized. This has just been extraordinary. What we have heard throughout this day, the panel this morning, our keynote speaker, the panel this afternoon. And there's so much to be energized by. I mean, if we think about the first panel, excavating all of this sort of history that we thought we knew, but there are even more things, even more people that we need to know about. And I've been, You know, I've worked with the AAEHC. I've been thinking about Black Episcopal history for quite some time, and there were many things that I learned that were new today. And so it's just incredible, and I'm energized by that. I'm also energized by the fact that people are thinking so intentionally and creatively about how to share this history, how to disseminate it. And it's very positive to see the many different, and to hear about the many different projects that are coming out of the African American Episcopal Historical Collection, and the ways that they're being shared, not only broadly across the Episcopal Church, but also just in broader ways, even beyond the Episcopal Church. And I think that is just wonderful to hear about. And I don't know about you, but I needed this. I think it is so good for us to gather and to have these kinds of events where we can share together, where we can learn together and we can grow together, learning what stories there are in this history to inspire us, to inspire our ministry. So thank you all for being here and for taking part in this very, very important day. And I want us to close, we have a few minutes, we have about 10 minutes or so, maybe. And so what I would like to do is to make this dialogic. I've shared very briefly some of my thoughts about the day, but I imagine that many of you have thoughts about this. I mean, you obviously have thoughts about all of the richness that you have encountered in these events. And so I want to offer this time for those of you who would like to share any particular takeaways that you have of things that you have heard, things that you might be inspired to do in your own context. Because we do this, obviously we are concerned about the history, we're interested in the history, but we study history because it's important for the things that we're doing today. We cannot know who we are, and we can't really plot out where we want to go, it seems to me, if we don't know where we've been, where we're coming from. So this is a time for us to just have a brief conversation. If there are thoughts that people have that you're taking away from these incredible speakers that we've had. So we have a taker, Peggy, and please wait for the microphone.
Thank you. I just wanted to observe that it was very powerful to see how important in the reparations initiatives the visual arts were. I mean, all the arts, there was mention of other art forms, but the visual arts, the icons were, and other forms of visual arts were so important. And I think that's a testament to the power of the visual arts. So as someone who teaches about it and makes it, that was very important to me to see, so.
Thank you, Peggy, and may that continue. Yeah. Any other takeaways from the day? Reverend Kim, and then.
Thank you. I am not a seminarian. I come out of the academy. My husband happens to be a priest. But one thing I have been very, very aware of, and I said this to Deacon Natalie, is that I've been thinking all day long about these dystopian times we're living in, and the war on ideas. And what we're looking at least what's coming up today, is really taboo discourse. It's just that we're in safe space when it's coming up. But Deacon Natalie's story and many other things draw a direct line from the sin of slavery, of enslavement, to the lunacy that we see going on with this war on ideas. I'm wondering what's coming next. Book burning? I mean, it happened as recently as World War II. So we're not necessarily out of the woods. And with my own studies in literary history and having to know histories of empires and so on and so forth, we as human beings have been here before with this irrationality. And we need to be aware that we can't say that it won't happen again, because it can, and it will. But the base of it all is power and economics. Discourse like this threatens to destabilize primarily the economic system. And we need to have the courage and the faith, because we can't fight it physically. I mean, they're too irrational, they're too crazy. We see what's happened with Hamas. People don't want to talk about their side of the story, but it's real. And we need to be aware that we are in very, very trying times. We can't sit here like we're just in this wonderful academic environment. And what we're doing here is far more important than just having a fun time with the history of ideas. Well, I'm not a theologian or anything like that, but I've read some stuff. Okay.
That's
Thank
evident.
you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. And I appreciate that. That's exactly what I was meaning to say about the fact that I personally felt like I needed this time and I needed this space, you know? Yeah, that's wonderful. Reverend Kim.
So one of the major takeaways for me has to do with the self-judgment that we apply to our history and to our experience, especially for minority populations or persons of color. We tend to look at our lives and undervalue them so that our story is not preserved. In the History Makers, when she mentioned Dr. Angelou, and what happened to works of hers, and she only touched on it, I felt, because the impact of the tragedy behind what happened to some of her original works is so significant. And it happens all the time in Black communities and communities of color, where we do not appreciate self and our story enough because we think it's not equal to or as good as or as impactful as others, and we end up not preserving that history. So I think it's important for myself, and I would imagine others, that we stop that work of self-judgment, because there's a movement to wipe out the stories. So whether or not you consider yours to be significant, stories as a whole are being asked to be taken off of the table for consideration and telling. And it's important that somebody who only wants an example of a faithful person who has managed to get a good job and hold a good job and raise a family, that story is part of the repertoire of what we celebrate as a community. And so I guess my takeaway is, quit judging. Let's quit judging ourselves. Let's leave that to God. See what God wants to make of our stories by taking the time to reach out to Riley and reach out to History Makers and reach out to other venues that are collecting histories and tell the stories of our lives, because we can't tell a full truth unless the truth is out there. So let's all participate in being able to do that is my takeaway.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think it's important to to add to what you were saying. I think it's important also to take the time to educate each other about the importance of saving these records and the kinds of resources that we have, such as the AAEHC, such as History Makers, all the different kinds of resources that are out there to enable us to do that. So for us to just make people aware, because they may not be aware, and so it's incumbent upon all of us to do that work.
And thank you for the work that's been done so far in this one day to educate us on what's out there, because History Makers in the way they work was new to me.
Go ahead.
I guess this corner is taking over. We don't want to take over. You notice that. What I'm taking away from this and what I'm struck by is I guess our brother Christopher was talking about Bishop Tillman and what he was doing with his slaves and how they were buried with no names on the graves and what have you, which I think was very important. It made two things. It made me realize how important that contributions of African Americans in the Episcopal Church have been there for years, but it hasn't been recognized. And now we are now beginning to unearth all that, and we're just appalled by the impactfulness of it. And the second thing that just kind of occurred to me was seeing those graves, unmarked graves, and now being not even recognized in the Episcopal Church. And all of a sudden now, in the 21st century, we have the presiding bishop who is over the Episcopal Church. I mean, how far we have come with that, and that story is now being told, and it is being recognized in a meaningful kind of way, that everybody can appreciate the value of the contribution of all the African Americans in the Episcopal Church. So that's been very, very powerful for me in this whole seminar. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead. Unless, are there people, I kind of have turned my...
I know.
Are there people who've had their hands up out this way? Okay.
Well, since it's over here.
Okay.
So my name is Alelia Bundles, and I'm a friend of Riley's, which is why I'm here. But I also write history and biography, so I was particularly encouraged by the panel, and I just applaud you for your courage in telling these stories. And the Episcopalian Church is very fortunate to have those records. Many people do not have those records, and so you're able to tell that story. I was sharing with Mr. Pupke that I'm going to be speaking in Indianapolis at the National Humanities Council's annual conference, and part of what I'm going to be talking about is book banning and anti-CRT and all those things. So thank you for you said everything that I wanted to say, so I don't have to say it. But especially at this moment, it's so important to speak these truths. And I will just add, when you're talking about Episcopalians, so I grew up in a Presbyterian church, perhaps the only denomination with fewer African Americans in the Episcopal Church.
Thank you. Okay. Is there, just see if there's anybody over this way? Oh, Casey. Cannon Eiffel had her hand up in the back.
Thank you. First, I'd like to congratulate you on the hard work in bringing all of what we saw today, to bringing that together. It was both inspirational as well as really giving us not only the information, but inspiring us to take these messages and these stories out of this place, because we are in the church and the church is in the world, and we have a lot of young people who are coming up after us that are being denied this kind of opportunity. And so it might be well behoove us here who have participated and partaked in this wonderful menu to just go out and continue to tell the story, share our own stories, share our own struggles, so that our young people who are coming up they have something other than the social media. They have something other than the violence that's out there, so that we can sort of channel them into other directions, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you. And the good news is these were live streamed and therefore recorded, and so you should be able to access these events for later and to share with others. Father Garfield?
Yes, I just want to say, coming from the cradle of the Confederacy, deep down south in Alabama, to say I have learned a lot. Secondly, our stories connect. I thought we had it bad in Alabama, but my Lord, it's all over the South. But yet, I saw the faith of our people, the perseverance and the willingness to continue, not to leave the church. Because I've been asked that many times, why do you want to stay in this uppity, rich, white church? I've been asked that, and every clergy person, and even lay people have been asked that. It is the faith we believe in Jesus and also in a beloved community. And that is why I bring you good news that there are folks in deep down South Alabama who are still hanging in there, even though almost every predominantly black church in Alabama was asked to move. Move and we'll provide you a place. That's the power of a rich, uppity church. They didn't beat us out. They invited us to move. They move, but yet they continue to participate. And that's a blessing from God. And I thank you for all sharing what you did today.
Amen. Thank you. Canon Collins, you?
Thank you so much. I want to just, for us to all stand and give a round of applause to these two gentlemen. They have done such a fabulous job, because I'm going to just tell you, my struggle for over 20 years to get the piece of history cataloged someplace in this church came about because of the work of this library. So I really want us to thank God for these gentlemen. Both, and where is, I don't see her. Where is, yeah. Where's Ebony, Melina?
She's back
there. She
there.
is. Ebony, stand up. She was here back in the, give her a hand. Give her a hand. She was there. Amen. I'm looking for Reverend Milana. She might have just left the room. But we need to really thank God for the work that they're doing, because I'm telling you, nobody would take the work seriously. I'm just saying from experience, they would not take this work seriously, and these two gentlemen did. So let's put our hands together this afternoon. Thank God for them. And thank you all so very much.
Well, we are over time, and I want to make sure that you have a bit of a break before we head into dinner, for those who are staying for dinner. We have another keynote speaker who will be with us over dinner. We have some videos and some other things to watch over dinner. So the intellectual stimulation, the spiritual stimulation will continue. But let's take a break now. And so go in peace, and we'll see you a little bit later.